All right, so now I've got my layers kind of cut out. Now, it becomes an issue when you're working with multiple layers and composites of how to easily select your layers. And I don't want to take the time to label each of these. So one easy way is to use what's called the auto select function on your move tool. So the move tool is the top of your toolbar, so the arrow. If you click auto select for layer at the top, that means whenever I click on a layer, it will automatically select that layer. So you'll see that the highlighting will change as I click on different layers. And that will help me. We have to turn this off later when we start dealing with more transparency and having a lot of overlaps. And you want to build from the background up. So what I'm going to put in first is the sky. And the way you can do that is by selecting that layer, kind of dragging it in place, and then moving it down. You can even put it behind your sketch. And you can put your sketch on multiply mode if you scanned it, so you're only seeing the lines like lightly overlaid. And I might even take the opacity down on my sketch a little bit. So I can get a sense of what that sky might look like, and then I can even resize it with that in mind. So I want to be on my sky layer. Can play with shrinking it a little bit. Okay. Now I have this other sky layer. I might bring that in. Let's see. Up here, and then maybe just right there. And kind of line it up with the horizon. And I can move that down to being in the background as well. Okay, now I'm going to turn off the sketch just because it's in the way, or I'll just move the sketch behind just so you can see this clearly. Because this now becomes the issue. We have two 100% cutouts, two different layers. And I want to kind of merge them together. And it's really easy to do with things like this, which are organic, with clouds. And I'm not going to worry about the color yet, or the value, but I am going to worry about the edges. So we're going to use eraser tools, right? And also transform tools. So if I want this horizon to line up with that horizon, what do? Well, I pick this foreground layer, I transform it, and I can rotate it slightly, right? So that those horizons line up. So do as much as you can with basic scaling, rotating, transform tools. But then we're going to use the eraser tool for the first time. And the eraser tool gets rid of pixels, but you have options at the top, these tool options, that are very important. You want a fairly large size eraser, but you want to be using one of these two middle brushes. This is a hard-edged eraser that's pressure sensitive to scale with your tablet, so it means the harder you press, the more of the circle it will erase. So, and then you want a hardness dependent on what you're erasing. Because I'm erasing textures that are very soft, I want a hardness that's pretty soft. And so it will transition slowly between the two of them. Okay. And now I'm going to go to those cutout seams, and I'm going to start erasing with this big soft eraser at a 100% opacity. So I'm just removing pixels and softening those transitions. So they start to blend together. And no, the colors don't match exactly, and we have slightly yellower and stormy clouds in one layer, and brighter, less saturated clouds in the other layer. But we'll make those color adjustments after we take care of these edges. Now, at this point, you can always use your history to go back steps if you erase too much. This is why we want at least 200 history steps, because each of these little movements can be pretty dramatic. So at this point, I've softened the edges, but this is a pretty big divide there, and I want to make that more gradual. So now I can take my opacity down on my eraser and kind of step it slowly from one image to the other, as long as there's overlap. If I run out of overlap, I'm stuck. I have to go one or the other. But by just erasing a little bit, I can make those relationships more believable between two different layers. I can extend this. So the eraser tool is a really powerful, interesting tool. And what it has given me is a sky that doesn't look like either of the two skies that I'm compositing from. Makes it look like its own thing. And the key is softening those edges. Make sure you're also erasing from the right layer. So that's why I like to zoom in when I do that, so I can see the effect of what I'm working on. So now I need to erase the edges on this side. There's a lot of pixel resolution there. So a lot of using the spacebar and moving around your image. And when I start, I want to get rid of that hard edge. I start by just using a really soft edge eraser at 100% opacity, but then when I want to transition it in, I'll go to a much lower opacity. Touch it a little bit more lightly. And I always like the pressure sensitive brush. If you want your brush to vary in opacity, you would use these two. So if I use the soft brush that varies in opacity, it will always fill the whole circle, but the harder I press, the more opaque the erasing will become. So that's kind of a preference thing, but I like having control of the size of the eraser more and controlling the opacity up here. Because it's much easier to control the opacity up here than to keep on changing the size of your brush. Remember, your history, you can always go back as many steps as you like. And Command minus to zoom out. I don't need to worry about those edges because those are off of my composite anyway. All right, so I've got that background in. Now if I turn my sketch back on, and I might take my sketch and put it on top of everything because I have it in multiply mode, and I can turn it off and on just so I can reference it. But now what else is in the background? Well, that's street. So this layer, I have my auto select on, I move this layer over into my picture here. I think I'm going to let maybe a little bit more sky show than I have in my sketch, and that's just fine. So I've placed it. Now I'm going to turn off the sketch, and now I'm going to work on getting a better selection of this street level background. Now, what I could do is I could use the lasso, and I could really carefully cut it out. And sometimes that's your best option. Kind of delete it chunk by chunk. But luckily, my reference is pretty sharp. There's a pretty big difference between the sky, the kind of gray sky here, and the sharp edges of this skyline. So I'm going to use the faster selection tools, like the magic wand. And I'm going to use a tolerance of 32, which is a good default. And hold down Shift to add into that selection, because I want some of the wires and everything to stay there, not get erased. even though there can be a lot of them. This will give a lot more believability to my composite. If the sky is showing through, whoops, everywhere the sky needs to show through. And if you want really exact selections, you change the sample size to point sample. And you're just holding down Shift, adding to your selections. And it will just match exactly where you click with whatever tolerance you build in. Now, even so, it will miss some things, and then I can always modify my selection, like with the lasso tool here, and minus out this edge of the building, which I thought was a little too close to the sky's color to keep. Okay, now before I go too long, I want to make sure this is working. And so I'm just going to hit delete and see how that looks. Command D to deselect, and I've replaced the sky for the most part. So in places where I can still do it, I can go back and I can delete it section by section. And remember, we're dealing with very high resolutions here. So what looks really pixelated when it's up close is going to look very smooth and believable when printed out. We can always view it at 100% if you want to kind of see what the print resolution is, and we're at that right now. It will tell you in the bottom left-hand corner. So the key to Photoshop is often just having good selections, knowing how to manipulate them, get them. But it has a lot to do with the ease of your reference to use. Like this power line here is a nightmare for lots of little cutouts to have the sky show through. But in that way, it will feel very integrated into the other layers. And even if I want to distort it or move it, now all this work I've done to kind of erase out the background will still help, even if I use this resource in a different way. So whenever you have a selection, you can hold down Shift and you can add to it with selection tools, or you can hold down Alt Option and subtract from it. And Alt Option is all one key. They're all around the spacebar. Those are our most common modifier buttons in Photoshop. All right. Almost there. Again, we're not changing the color or the lighting of any of this reference yet. We're just trying to get now refined cutouts. So the first step was like taking scissors to a magazine and cutting out roughly around the sections you wanted to keep, making sure you leave plenty of information to overlap. Now it's like taking an X-Acto knife and getting the exact selections we want to keep, letting them show through. And this kind of man-made stuff is more difficult because it's got